Welcome to the Ryan Research Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Ryan. I am joined today by Juan Rojas. He is a writer about Hamiltonian economics, not just in the US, but around the world. And I would like to introduce him now and offer him a chance to give his biography.
Thanks for having me on, Peter. Glad to be on the podcast. Let me think about introducing myself. As you said, I've written in American Affairs, specifically two articles, one on Mexico and its current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's a really interesting, idiosyncratic kind of figure. I have some critiques, but I find him very interesting. And another about Brazil. It's a kind of similar overview of the past 3 decades of economic policy failures, in my opinion, specifically regarding neoliberal economics, and also what, in my opinion, was a far more prosperous age, Brazil's mid-century industrialization. What else? I'm also a Compact Magazine's newest columnist on Latin American affairs and Iberia as well. So I have a few articles there, and as you said, we were talking a sec before we started recording that we can't use the P word, protectionism, but I have no problem using that word. We can consider ourselves protectionists, pragmatic protectionists, double P word.
I like it, double P. So can you explain your trajectory into pragmatic protectionism, or just this general school of economics that you're interested in, and then the trajectory of your interest in Latin American affairs?
The first question is really interesting because it's something I've thought about partially, and I can't always quite place it. I actually come from a more leftist tradition, so I never really had an issue with state involvement in the economy and whatnot. I'm not a communist, never have been. I was always more inclined towards the left in economic thought. And funnily enough, I the other day I was thinking to myself, I reflect on this frequently. Way back in like the early, I was very young, but in the late 2000s and even the early 2010s, I remember because I was always interested in politics, always kept up on the news and stuff like that, and I remember reading and sympathizing with thinkers and writers, on the left, who would say things like it would be critical of free trade and outsourcing, and criticize it from the point of view that look, think about, all this exploitation in China, the people working in sweatshops and whatnot. And somewhere down the line, I realized that a lot of that got lost as the American left really embraced free trade. And that really got on steroids once Trump came onto the scene, because, naturally Democrats just have to be opposed to what Trump is for. And conversely, Trump opened up that space on the right to rethink, at least on the trade end, classical economics, neoliberal economics, whatever you want to call it. But I don't know. It's I guess on a separate track, around the mid to late 2010s, I became very disillusioned. And the irony is, I always say that when I went to university, it ironically pushed me more towards the center or the right. This was during the Great Awakening, as it's called now. So a lot of the really kind of loony ideas and progressive thought, I've always been relatively contrarian. So I just out of opposition to that, I guess I moved more towards the center and even the right, and started to sympathize with kind of anti-woke thinkers on both sides. Some of them I realized were kind of useless, like what's called the intellectual dark. Bankrupt intellectually, to be honest. Yeah, then
Sorry, can you just repeat the last 10 seconds? Your recording cut out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, around the mid 2010s, I started to follow and sympathize with like anti-woke thinkers on both sides, like what's called the intellectual dark web, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and eventually came to realize that they really didn't have much to offer other than, the marketplace of ideas and all that, which is a fine notion. But yeah, on economics, they really don't have answers or even probe anything worthwhile. I started to read, yeah, old thinkers, both American and otherwise. You've talked on the podcast, on the importance of Hamilton and List. And interestingly, in Latin America, the economic thought of Latin American framers, such as Simón Bolívar, Santander, San Martin, and even Jose Marti were very, very interesting and of a like mind with that of Hamilton. But here in the U.S., I read the American Conservative for many years and began realizing that on the right there was some interesting thought on economics, and on reflecting on the history of the American system. Discovered American Affairs and read it now for a few years, and yeah, can't recommend anything else really on both economic and intellectual thought in the U.S.
Gotcha. So you kind of came from, I guess we can call it like a normie sort of center-left background, and that kind of exposed you to some ideas, or not being so like agitated by sort of, kind of a government hand on certain things. And then as you got on, obviously the sort of left takes this turn, especially with economics. And then you kind of find some of the oppositional figures to be intriguing, but ultimately kind of lacking in the depth that you were seeking. And that's what led you to ultimately this deep historical foundation of the American economic tradition. So that's the correct line of thought there.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more thing on that. In the present day, I honestly consider myself a pretty I was about to say non-ideological. That's not true. I'm very ideological, but non-partisan. I honestly, just in the horse race, politics, who's on top, this party, it's kind of bores me and upsets me in general. I actually think that there are good thinkers and good people on both sides. And frankly, find it to be a far more liberating way to live, just not being married to one or another party.
Yeah, and I found it because I had somewhat of a different journey, but I can relate to that sense of being unsatisfied with what was presented as opposition, or as presented as like, these are the only two choices to pick from, and especially from particular elements in the right wing that really emphasize traditional and historical legacies and like heritage. And you actually open a history book and start looking through what went down. And it's completely at odds with actual heritage.
Totally. And that's something that definitely appeals to me. I've always been a huge fan of history. I was always reading history books from a young age. And funnily enough, yeah, in recent years, there's something that enrages me about progressives is just the impulse to dismiss history. It's like, oh, well, everyone was a bigot back then, so who cares what they thought? But which is just infuriating. But I was going somewhere with this. I just forgot. I'll let you take over and it'll come back to me.
So I want to shift into more than, okay, like grew up in America, and then you start to take this term with economics, and then you also start to focus on countries in Latin America. So
Oh
tell
yeah,
me more about how you became more and more contextualized within the Latin American framework.
right. And I just remember what I was gonna say. Yeah, on the right, I mean, and a lot of this has to do with my interest in Latin America. I am Colombian American. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, and like any good, you know, Latino here in the U.S., family is extremely important to me. I do have a degree of sympathy with, traditional norms and values, and that's something that does speak to me on the right. Um, and I grew up in South Florida. I'm currently speaking to you from Miami. It's called the capital of Latin America. There's people here from any Latin American country you can think of, although obviously Cuban Americans are the core community here. But yeah, I traveled frequently as a child to Colombia, and actually after I completed my bachelor's, I went to live and work in Colombia, actually for a professor of mine at the University of Florida. We worked on a research project on community policing in the city of Medellin, Colombia, which was really, really interesting. I saw a lot of good and bad, but yeah, I always had an interest in the region, and have traveled to different countries, both for tourism and otherwise. If you come here to Miami, everyone speaks Spanish. It's interesting too because immigrants that come here are very patriotic, not just for their own country but for the U.S. Immigrant communities are among the most patriotic for the United States. So they're really grateful that this country took them in and all the opportunities it gave them.
Great. So now taking this Hamiltonian economics and this interest in Latin America, how did you start to apply that lens to that geography? And what were some of the things that surprised you, maybe that like a preconceived notion you had in the past that started to get changed as you started to apply the Hamiltonian economics to it?
Let me think. I guess it opened up a appreciation for certain leaders it just kind of political tendencies that I was more inclined to write off. The case that comes to mind is Bolivia, which I always knew was interestingly very fiscally responsible. If you know anything about Bolivia, it's thought of as a kind of success story in that since the MAS, the movement to socialism, as it's called, the Movimiento al Socialismo, took over, they have experienced incredible economic growth and been very prudent stewards. Among Latin American leftists, notably, they saved a lot of money, although now they've used it up since the pandemic and trying to control inflation. That's another conversation. But they definitely had a more nationalist bent towards economics, which sadly there hasn't been much industrialization. But prior to the presidency of Evo Morales, yeah, there were a lot of fights over, natural gas and how it should be used, whether through exploited through private companies or otherwise. The MAS took over and nationalized the sector and made sure that the gains went to the common people. And that's gone. The contrasting case is the disastrous example of Venezuela, whereas in Bolivia, and they're both allies. The current government in Bolivia is very far left, especially in terms of international relations. Yeah, they'll back Maduro and the Cuban regime and whatnot. But in terms of practical economics, interestingly, yeah, they, as I said before, they saved a lot of money, which is something that in Venezuela they didn't do, which led to catastrophe. But things like that, and then just reading history, Latin America it's funny because today there's this enormous dichotomy between left and right, which is really can be really infuriating at times. But you look into the 20th century, and a lot of the really popular demagogues and even reformers and populists, they had interesting politics and were not necessarily, they crossed lines. Some over time became more right wing or left wing, switched back and forth, were opportunists. But a lot of those populists also were key in changing the conversation, the consensus towards a more developmental economics. In at least certain cases, sadly, in a lot of Latin American countries, there was more so only a push towards industrializing resources, as in, like, say, Mexico throughout the 20th century. But as I wrote about with Brazil, on the other hand, focused in heavy industry, the automotive sector, aircraft, and also in industrialize their energy sector. Have Petrobras and the like, which is absolutely necessary for more complex industrialization. Is something I spoke with Emmett Penny about on his podcast.
Yeah, fascinating. So maybe to set the table a little bit more, because we talked about Hamilton, which is an American founding father, from the 1770s to 1790s, playing a very large role. And then we're talking about Latin America and some of these influences that kind of focus at the latter half of the 20th century, where we're kind of talking about Cold War, periphery, geopolitics, and ideologies concerning like Marxism. And there's a bit of like a vacuum when those conversations are had. Whereas, could you maybe elaborate back in time to the foundations of Latin America coming out of the colonial period with its independence movements, and how those independent movements and what those leaders and their thought represented, how does that actually play into formulating some of the 20th century and 21st century outcomes that we see that might not always just be, readily called, oh, well, that's just Marxism or that's just U.S. capitalism. You can only pick one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the sad reality, there's a really fascinating, is he a historian, political theorist? I think he's specifically a political theorist at Johns Hopkins, called Simon. He has written a lot, on the economic thought of Latin American framers, as I mentioned before, Bolívar, Santander, in Mexico as well. And it's interesting because a lot of them shared similar views towards Hamilton, and the developmental tradition actually goes back centuries, some would even say thousands of years, to the city-states. But they had a similar view that industry was key, and it was essential, especially because the colonies had been so dependent on the motherland, on Spain and Portugal, that it was imperative to develop local industry, which is something that was mostly non-existent. I mean, Spain and Portugal ran these extremely extractive operations of just, taking out resources, whether agricultural or mineral. The amount of like silver and gold that were extracted out of like Bolivia and Peru and Mexico were immense. Leaders like Bolívar had the sense that we need to use tariffs, we need to use subsidies to protect our local industry. The infant industries argument, whatever. In tandem with that, a lot of these leaders had always stressed the importance of union. Maintaining larger states. The advisor to the emperor in Brazil, José Bonifácio, had to deal with a ton of secessionist movements in Brazil. Brazil luckily didn't fall apart. For example, Gran Colombia, which is now today Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And there was always this argument in terms of protectionism and developmentalism, that for economies of scale to work, it's necessary to have a large market. So having a larger, maintaining the unity of these larger territorial units is key. Sadly, however, yeah, in a lot of cases, despite the economic thought of these framers in the long term, there were waves, but during the 19th century, a lot of that developmental bent was thwarted by the regional interests of local caudillos, warlords that were more keen towards maintaining, the favor of rentier, extractive elites, plantation elites, oftentimes slave owning elites, for example, in Brazil. And that, for example, was the case in Venezuela with Jose Antonio Paez, who was just kind of a warlord who decided it'd be more lucrative for him to maintain a balance over the plantation elites and cattle elites in Venezuela.
Yeah, and this is a very common type of trend that you see in other post-colonial states that often goes unremarked upon. Obviously, I focus on Ireland a lot, and I see a lot of that there. So as you're in the 19th century and you're coming out of it, which country in particular do you think kind of harnesses enough of the right ideas and does start to modernize?
During the 19th century?
Kind of that turn from the 19th into the 20th.
Okay, yeah. On the one hand, Brazil is key in that it managed to stay united, which is very notable. And there are a lot of factors in that. And actually, one thing I should say also, moving on, is that for me, the key difference between North America or the United States, Canada, and South America is the fact that the American colonies or the British colonies, Canada and the U.S. had a degree always of self-rule and also native industry. As a result, after independence, there was already some tradition and far less need for learning by doing to figure things out for themselves. There was some degree of textile manufacturing in the Northeast from the beginning. That helped get off the ground easier towards further development. In Latin America, that really wasn't the case because power was so centralized in Iberia. This is something that leftists in Brazil say all the time, how Brazil didn't have its first university until like 18 whatever. Anyone who wanted to go into higher education would have to go to Europe, to Portugal to study, and there were similar cases in other countries, but definitely on the industry front, the only industry that existed was completely extracting mineral and agricultural products. But as far as later in the 19th century and going into the 20th, Chile, which I actually am not an expert on, might be worth looking into in that they always had a very strong military tradition. They had a lot of links and advisors in the Prussian military, which you can see in that the military garb of the Chilean forces is very influenced by Prussian garb of the time to this day. So I would suppose that there was a degree of industrialization, at least to feed the military. And a lot of national security thought is always inclined towards protectionism. Yeah, we have Washington saying that it's like, oh, we can't be importing weapons. We need to make them here. We can't be depending on our enemy Britain for our goods of national security. But at the turn of the century, still, all countries in Latin America, including the important ones, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, were largely extractive. And in some cases, this was successful. in Brazil, the turn of the century is called the coffee and milk epoch because of the centrality of exporting coffee and milk in the states of Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, which actually the presidents alternated. But anyway, similarly, Argentina used to be one of the per capita one of the richest countries in the world, on par with the U.S., Australia, at the turn of the century because of the export of beef primarily. When you get to the Depression and the World Wars, that essentially, that was a kind of forced protectionism. The exports of those goods were suddenly cut off. Leaders had to suddenly think of ways to fill those gaps, and that also led to political conflict. Led to the rise of leaders like Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, who was really key in changing the consensus towards a more developmental focus. Similar Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina, in Ecuador, Velasco Ibarra, and in Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, who was similarly a contemporary of Vargas, FDR, Perón. And I would say that definitely the most successful case of industrialization during the 20th century was Brazil, in that they developed high-tech industry for export in high-value goods. But still, sadly, the developmental focus in most cases focused on making the extractive sectors more sophisticated, having national companies in mining, oil, gas, etc.
Interesting. And so we set that up. We have the independence movement with a lot of revolutionary intention that's beleaguered by economic structures that are pre-existing that tend to replicate themselves in a post-colonial circumstance. But then as the 19th century gets underway, there are more attempts to modernize, maybe leaning into the extractive side of the economy, but nonetheless improving prosperity. And then you kind of fast forward into middle of the 20th century. But I think it's important to kind of, because obviously America plays a big role in Latin America, or the United States plays a big role in Latin America. So the introduction of the United States heavily into Latin America comes with the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1902. So circumstances are that the European powers like Britain and Germany and Italy, they're providing a lot of foreign debt to these countries in Latin America, specifically Venezuela in this case. And, they're kind of having a dispute. Payments aren't going back and forth. So the Europeans want to do a naval blockade down there. And then America comes in and says, you're not doing that. And then they
I was about to say, I believe that was in 1902, 1906. Yeah, that there was an embargo from Britain and France on Venezuela, and the U.S. came in and said, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, so this basically starts the expansion of U.S. influence down south. And so how does this make us think critically about Latin America, that the idea that foreign debts got them into a vulnerable place with the Europeans, and then America coming in, which then in fact replicates a lot of the foreign financial relationships. So yeah, if you could speak to that.
Oh boy, we could have a whole conversation just on this topic. There's a lot to say. The hand of the U.S. in Latin America was always strongest in the Caribbean and in Central America. I think this is a sort of stupid debate that, people talk about U.S. imperialism, and U.S. imperialism was really bad in Latin America. But, some conservatives will say it's just they're trying to blame everything on the U.S. and, not take responsibility for any of, the mistakes of, domestic leaders. And that's absolutely true. I mean, in a lot of cases, the US was just kind of fomenting existing oligarchic interests. Just like, I don't know if you saw this with, this news that came out with Imran Khan, that the U.S. There's nuance to this. It's not that the U.S. came in and told the Pakistani military, "Hey, we don't like Khan, get rid of him." There was already a pre-existing animosity towards Khan. The military was inclined to do this, and it just so happened, the U.S. embassy tells the military, "Hey guys, if you actually go through with this, we would actually like it because we don't like Imran Khan's position on, the conflict in Ukraine." And his perceived sympathy towards Russia. And so the military is like, "Oh, awesome. We have the approval of the US." And you see that similarly in a lot of cases in Latin America. Even the most egregious examples like the coup against Allende in Chile, in Guatemala as well. But yeah, there's certainly an argument that some countries, especially the ones in Central America and the Caribbean, would be better off if the US had never intervened. And specifically in Central America and the Caribbean, Haiti, Guatemala, Nicaragua, I mean, the U.S. directly invaded a lot of these countries, set up puppet governments that were in some cases genocidal and horrific. And yeah. Later on, Kennedy had the Alliance for Progress, which was had a developmental orientation. The vision was that, in order to stop communism, there needed to be a degree of redistribution and leaders inclined towards development precisely to prevent the masses from rising up and in a communist uprising. And that kind of later went by the wayside with Johnson and Nixon. But yeah, it's not all bad. On the other hand, because that's the thing. The reality is that Latin American elites from the beginning have always been very inclined to just follow mindlessly whatever prevailing currents are in North America and Europe. I mean, you see this with a lot of elite thinkers at the end of the 19th century, for example, in Chile and Argentina, that would say things like, "Oh, no, we need these immigrants from these European countries because our domestic population, they're just lazy and they won't work." And so to this day with the economic thought, I mean, just look at the interest rates in Latin America that by region are the highest in the world. The conventional thinking regarding, "Oh, we need to raise interest rates to kill the economy, to kill inflation," is on steroids in Latin America compared to even the US. But they take their pointers, they look at whatever Europe and the US does and think, "Oh, if we just do more of this and to a more severe degree, that's how we'll develop and become rich."
Yeah, so we now have this confluence of endogenous economic structural factors of cattle ranching and other extractive industries like that, the local colonial elite taking leadership of a post-colonial state, and other dynamics there, with the intersection of European and American foreign finance capital coming down there and shaping things. And then as history progresses, certainly the geopolitical security questions start to shape things more than just like pure like economic numbers and cents. So now we have a pretty good, I think, overview of like how Latin America got there. Sure, you say something.
Yeah. Well, one thing I forgot to mention that's super interesting. There's an excellent book. There's one more point on the Caribbean called "Bankers and Empire" that details how actually the U.S. essentially set up the entire financial systems of Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Panama, Cuba, and like these in the early 20th century. Essentially, a lot of these countries didn't have central banks. It was J.P. Morgan and Citibank that were the central bankers of these countries. It was completely incredible, and there were absurd degrees of corruption. A lot of this actually came to a head after there were hearings about this in Congress here in the U.S. Of a lot of these abuses by bankers. I forget the committee. There were all these committees during the New Deal that rung up a lot of bankers for the depression and whatnot. But some of these executives, actually went to jail. Incredibly, something that this is something a lot of people don't talk about. But it really does show the hand of the U.S. and a lot of these countries that are seen as a back door. Famously also, Cuba, which was invaded like 5 times by the U.S., even up until the revolution in '59. All the phone lines were, American owned.
Yeah, and I think we start to, we can identify this, what seems like played out trope almost in 2023, which is American meddling around the world often produces more harm than good in blowback years down the road. And you look at a state like Cuba, and you start to see, so there's a lot of meddling and there's a lot of manipulation, and people are getting angry, and sort of a more reformist, just movement can't really take root. And what ends up happening is it becomes one of the biggest communist adversaries of the 20th century for the U.S.
Yeah. This is something. I'm in South Florida, so I think I told Emma Penny this. Down here, the view you'll get of everything relating to Latin America is just kind of what's good or bad for the Cuban regime. It's just like, oh, so and so, he's an apologist for the Cuban regime, so he's bad, and it's just and nothing else matters. And oh, so and so's good because he's an anti-communist. And it's just a little ridiculous. But what's funny to me is that a great contrasting case is Puerto Rico. Cuba and Puerto Rico. You talk to any Cuban American, obviously the prevailing current is American conservatism. Naturally, I understand why Cuban Americans are inclined towards the right. It's an opposition to the horrific Cuban regime on the island. Alternatively, Puerto Ricans tend more towards the left because they're responsible for a lot of their own problems, but the restrictive trade and results of U.S. colonialism essentially is also in large part responsible for the island's current predicament. It's just to me a fact of history that the U.S. pushed Cuba to the left into embracing communism, which, as you said, was directly in its own interest, and then communism pushed the Cuban people way to the right. So, yeah.
So we see these forces develop, and this is where the more that I've studied, and I certainly have not gone as deep as you in Latin American history, the more that I see the accusations of Marxism as very shallow and very disconnected to this long history leading up to it. And Marxism as a brand is almost it's fat. It's a fad of the 20th century. It's sort of it's applicable in some circumstances, but it just totally disregards tons of thinkers that were in Latin America talking about these things, like you said, tariffs and other ways to industrialize for many, many years. And the very legitimate grievances that they had against European powers, and especially the United States. So so now we're here. We can start to see okay, now we're getting into that more pop culture image of Latin America in the 20th century. Okay, so now we're here, and we have kind of the chessboard set. Where do we see successes and failures as we come out of the mid 20th century into the latter half of the 20th century?
I'll speak as to Brazil because this is the country that for me has more success stories, and I most recently wrote about on this topic. Um, Brazil, you look at 10 of its 20 largest companies, 10 either were once or are still state owned. So, we're talking Petrobras, Embraer, the aircraft manufacturer, hugely successful. It's to me, honestly, the single greatest Latin American success story in history as far as firms go. It competes with multinational competitors such as the Canadian Bombardier. It's Embraer has even helped China develop some of its own native aircraft industry. And yeah, other cases like some of the current banks in Brazil were previously state-owned, but all this was a result of the 40-year period, between the 1930s or no longer than that, 50s up until the 1980s, 90s, between governments of both the right and the left, starting with Getulio Vargas, who himself, as you were just alluding to, this kind of simplistic vision of everything being Marxist or not, is a really fascinating figure. The dude was a dictator at one point during the 1930s, kind of a quasi-fascistic dictatorship called the Estado Novo, the new state. I had a lot of sympathies with Franco's Spain, Salazar's Portugal, and Mussolini and Hitler at the time, when he saw that the Axis powers were likely to be defeated. He embraced the U.S., and Roosevelt famously went over to Brazil. If you look at my Twitter, I have a great painting of the two of them during Roosevelt's visit. Vargas is deposed in a coup in 1950, and then is democratically elected back into office in 1954, popularly. But even during his like fascistic period, he always emphasized, like the rights of workers, and sectoral unionization and stuff like that. He's known in Brazil as o pai dos pobres, the father of the poor. And so when he was popularly elected in 1954, he actually ran and governed on like a populist left-wing agenda. You see something similar with Perón, who likewise he studied in Italy while Mussolini was in power. Then when he came into government, he had some kind of fascist sympathies, sympathized with the Axis powers. Then when he was overthrown in 1955, he was exiled to Franco's Spain. Then he returns to office, but in the 70s, I believe in 1973, and only died a year after. But prior to his return, there were a lot of Marxist guerrillas that, in a similar kind of vein, idolized him because he was, the champion of the working class, the worker, and the poor.
Yeah, so we see these idiosyncratic leaders rise, and we see some success stories. So then, as we start to approach the 70s and into the 80s, is there a significant change across Latin America that causes turmoil?
In terms of economics, the big change comes in the 1990s overall across the regions. There's variations by countries, but neoliberal thought really takes over in the 90s, and so you also have these debt crises during the 1980s. The Federal Reserve in the U.S. hiking interest rates drastically has a huge impact in Latin America, makes lending far more difficult. There's a thought that but the problem is statism, state interventionism. What we need to do to get ahead is just step back, let the market do its work, and we will develop. And so in the case of Brazil, which is a good example, you see this in almost every country. There's mass privatizations of state industries. And in some cases, this is beneficial, though there's nuance. But there's a direct abandonment of industrial policy, which during that mid 20th century era, there were smart and pragmatic policies to boost industry, conditioning, increased output with subsidies and tax cuts. So, you'd cut taxes if you see increased production in a specific company. This wasn't always the case, and there's a lot of literature that talks about how the mechanisms for enforcing that sort of conditionality weren't always great. Yeah, in the 90s, they start deregulating these industries, flexibilizing labor rights, which creates a lot of precarity and cutting social safety nets. A lot of criminological literature points to this for a lot of the rise in crime in Latin America. The region's unfortunately very well known for its organized crime. And there are obviously other factors, the war on drugs and the cocaine industry. And notably also the transition from dictatorships to democracies. And it was precisely these democracies, in most cases, that liberalized the economies. With the exception of Pinochet's Chile, actually, most of these military dictatorships were more protectionist oriented because they had that national security type of thought. Yeah, what we see in the long term, as in the US and elsewhere, is that the obsession with just market fundamentalism has really brought ruin. Brazil used to be a middling manufacturing power, and the thing is, it's key firms like Embraer and even Petrobras weren't profitable until the 1990s. That's the thing about industrial policy. It takes years to be successful, decades even. But not being profitable isn't necessarily a bad thing, so long as eventually you do become profitable. But those sectors throughout the 20th century were growing. What we've seen since the 1990s is that those sectors are now either stagnant or shrinking. And the narrative you hear from classical economics, which is just glorious, is that, this was inevitable. Eventually, we have to transition to a service economy and whatnot. It's like, well, yeah, maybe if you're already industrialized, but if you just prematurely industrialize it, it's like this only spells trouble. Better yet, the thinking is, we need to trim the fat. Government can't pick winners and losers. This will lead to more growth. Well, the evidence is in it. It hasn't. If you look at the so-called protectionist period, growth was, on the whole, in Latin America, around 5% for most of those decades. And specifically the 1970s in Brazil and Mexico, it was consistently around 10%. The bad side is that that did lead to a lot of overheating, and that there was a lot of inflation during this period. And as we know, Latin America has always struggled with inflation. To neoliberals' credit, that's something that has been controlled far better in the current era. But there's also really low growth. Since the 1990s, the median average GDP growth per year is like 1% to 2%. That's horrific in poor countries.
Shocker. Yeah. So bouncing off everything you just excellently explained there, I'd like to turn listeners to your essay in American Affairs Journal titled "The Center That Will Always Hold: Brazil's Lost Decades." And you have a very nice passage here, if you'll allow me to read your words for you.
Is that the section on corruption?
No. It's towards the end here.
Okay, yeah, great.
So you say, neoliberals now shamelessly concede that market fundamentalism did not bring the growth that was promised. It is true, they say, that growth rates have remained stagnant since the 1990s, though they still refuse to recognize that growth under ISI was double that of the current period. They argue instead that the fault lies with misguided governments that pursued extractive economies over the service sector, as if one did not complement the other. Evidently, in this view, development in Latin America will occur only if the region forges its own unprofitable, service-oriented tech companies. In the unlikely event that elites even consider the long-term pursuit of high-value own brand manufacturing, they believe the specter of automation all but ensures failure. And then ... Developmental economists are ultimately correct that the relative success of the Asian tigers derives from a variety of accountability mechanisms that are lacking in Brazil and much of Latin America, such as a capable state bureaucracies and sponsorship reciprocity, allocating subsidies in response to performance. Okay, so I think this is an amazing passage because you have bundled so much knowledge into a very well said, concise few sentences. And so let's just sort of examining that. Again, you start to get into the neoliberals are wrong, growth didn't happen, it happened more into the protectionist period. And then you start to get into this dichotomy between service sectors that are unprofitable, that are often tied to multinational corporations, versus high value own brand, as in native owned manufacturing. So can you start talking about more what's going on?
Right. So that fragment specifically, you know, the did it cut out? Oh, okay. All right. So that fragment specifically relates a lot to the previous article I wrote for American Affairs on Mexico. Mexico is super interesting because it actually industrialized into heavy industry during the neoliberal period, during the 1990s, as a result of NAFTA. Its maquila industry sprung up. But the thing is, it's like, this is a huge puzzle that economists always ponder. It's like, oh, why didn't that lead to prosperity? It's simple. Once China joined the WTO, Mexican manufacturing just could not compete with better Chinese products. But the thing is, it's like Mexican manufacturing doesn't really exist. Mexico's an assembly colony. They just assemble components, auto components, and other electronics. There are no Mexican manufacturing firms. They don't exist. The difference when you look at the Asian tigers, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, is that, yeah, they started out just assembling high-value manufacturing components for American companies, and then, you know, they developed their own national firms, Hyundai, Sony, Samsung, and that's what eventually allowed them to become rich countries. Mexico didn't do that, and definitely the rest of Latin America has not really done that either. But so, yeah, you read like the Financial Times or Bloomberg, and it's like, oh yeah. Look, the past 30 years have not gone right, but it's because, you know, entrepreneurial-minded leaders did not, you know, focus on services. Yes, they did. The service economies in Latin America have exploded since that time. It doesn't lead to much growth. There aren't economies of scale, and it's extremely precarious, especially, you know, when they're governed by like these extremely flexible labor laws. Which isn't to say also, you know, that because a lot of libertarians will complain and say, oh, there's still a lot of regulations in Latin America. Yeah, that's absolutely true. What I argue is that the direction since the 90s has always been towards more deregulation and liberalization. But anyway, yeah, like I caricature. I'm not sure if it's in that article or another recent president of Colombia called Iván Duque. his whole mantra during his government was the orange economy, which meant investing in Uber and other worthless tech companies. That's the key to the future in the mind of your typical, business oriented Latin American leader. Um, but
That's also just, that's basically the consensus, I think, globally for a lot of, countries that do not have like a Silicon Valley, which is
totally,
every other
yeah,
country.
yeah, it's great because it's like, no, look, guys, what you guys have to do is just go into tech. It's great because if you try it, you will never be able to compete with us.
Yeah. And so it's an interesting, propaganda pattern that, emerges in Latin America. It certainly emerges in Ireland. It emerges in certain other European states. I mean, I think the term in England is the what do they call it? They called it like the Silicon roundabout or something. So silly
They're
name.
worthless nowadays. They don't produce anything of value. It's all finance. And what good does that do when you cut off like one of the biggest clients were Russian companies and individuals in the UK finance. So
Yeah, and what's interesting, like I hear a lot from the Irish, is that ultimately there's so much attention placed on these tech startups. What ends up happening is these tech startups, they all need basically exponential economics, and they need to exit in like a 5 to 10 year horizon, usually in an IPO or an acquisition. If they magically somehow become big enough to sustain themselves after that as a profitable or not profitable company. So what ends up happening is like all this attention goes to like seeding investments in these companies, doing like accelerator programs, directing like all of the educational attention towards coding and all this type of stuff. And the entrepreneurs end up saying, the market is too small in my own country because the population size compared to other bigger countries or the world. So I have to go to the global hub to reach the global audience. Ultimately the investors, after you like get past seed stage, you need in the range of 5 million, 10 million, 20 million, rounds, and you're not going to get that in your peripheral country. You're going to get that in America and California. And then similarly, where you're going to IPO, you're going to IPO in the New York Stock Exchange. Yep. So that creates this highlighting of the problem where it's like all this focus on tech startups, where like they are very risk prone and ultimately in a lot of ways like not valuable. But for the ones that are, they end up actually extracting that value out of your own country.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so just rip off that.
Yeah. I mean, you brought up in that passage. I also mentioned automation. This is something great. You'll get also reading financial outlets. It's like no, guys, look, don't even think about it. If you even try manufacturing, there's automation, so that'll get you. Just don't bother. And it's like I'm actually agnostic. I think it's totally possible that in the future, maybe automation could have a significant impact in the lives of a lot of manufacturing workers in the future. The thing is, today, the evidence that I've seen is zero that manufacturing has had any impact, or that automation has had really any impact in taking away jobs. I mean, you look at South Korea, China, Japan, and their levels of automation are higher than in the U.S. So, and a greater share of the population is employed in manufacturing. So that to me is just absurd. Similarly, I think this is another passage in that article. It's like, yeah, guys, dude, don't bother. Look, we have comparative advantage. You don't. Only the greatest notion in economics is like, guys, no, don't bother. Comparative advantage. It's God-given. It's Taiwan just naturally has an advantage because of its sand. or something to make semiconductors.
Well, yeah, the chips started growing out of the trees. That's how they found them.
Exactly.
So, yeah, so then another critique that comes up next to automation is sort of like, oh, well, eventually you reach like wage ceiling where it's like you're no longer competitive. So you have to figure out what to do at that point because low-end manufacturing can't sustain you indefinitely. So where do you?
Yeah, yeah. The problem that China's run into now, among many others.
So what would you say to people that say like, okay, like maybe we concede some points, but you have to admit in the end, we're right, the neoliberals, because at some point you can't keep paying workers higher wages. You got to destroy the industry instead of paying them higher wages.
I don't know if that's necessary, if that's quite necessary, but I mean, you definitely always will need to diversify, move into other sectors, and yeah, just have some imagination, at least try. It's something I give and unfortunately in progressive circles, it's the push is always towards green tech, renewables, and all of that. But that could generate jobs. Yeah, at least there's some thinking on that, and it would just similarly be nice to see them diversify a little bit further.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think about like just going back to, let's say, the 20th century example of like Henry Ford and the famous, he paid his workers enough money so that they could afford the car that they were.
Yeah, that's absolutely the ideal.
Yeah. And so like you have this effect where rather than Ford saying, oh, well, this sucks, I have to obviously outsource my car manufacturing to some other country where I can pay the workers less to be competitive. But instead, he actually pays his workers a higher wage, and that actually stimulates Ford's internal economics,
Yeah, that stimulates
and then creates more of a bigger car industry with a more diversified these adjacent sectors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talking about China, we always talk about this. The Chinese social contract that's like, look, we control your life, surveil you, and can lock you up whenever we want, but we'll make you rich. Well, the thing is, it's like, not only will the poor get rich, the rich will get incredibly rich in China. So yeah, that's a good deal, and that's just the smart thinking in the long term. What's horrible in the West, and especially in Latin America, is just this myopic tendency towards self-sabotage. That it's like, no, we can't do that because, oh no, if I don't know, there's development and maybe we'll lose power or something, and it's just like, well, no, dude, this will help you too.
Yeah, so that gets into this perennial problem within the West of, and sort of the peripheral West, like Latin America, of sort of these elites going after extracting a larger percentage of the pie at the trade-off of the general pie getting smaller versus creating a bigger pie, having a more marginal slice of it that you'll probably end up getting more in absolute terms. Yeah, so it's this weird phenomenon. And then you remark upon the East Asian tigers, and I often look to them as phenomenal case studies. So can you speak more to what the East Asian tigers represent for us in the 20th century and how their economic models are something to really
it's funny because when I read like the Financial Times and Bloomberg, I find that the best reporters and thinkers and like the op-ed page are always those that cover Asia. The ones that cover Latin America are some of the absolute worst. Though I have seen some progress in recent years, but the reality is that if you look at the past, 80 years, 70 years, maybe even 100 years, there's been like 5 countries that have gone from being poor to rich, right? South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. Maybe Japan already was developed by that point. Yeah, Hong Kong. Who else? The Asian tigers. Anyway, everywhere else is a failure. I mean, you can say, oh, yeah, Steven Pinker. It's like, oh, we've seen progress. There's been some income growth or whatever. People are living longer. A lot of outcomes have improved. Sure, a lot of that's China. Oh, yeah, China, obviously, the big one that I forgot to mention. Like 60% of the total poverty reduction seen during the past 50 years, it's all China. So I mean, and a lot of people will sum that up. Oh, it's because they embrace capitalism. It's like, yeah, sort of. But it's not. They embraced it, but it's not. They have a peculiar system, let's say, and it's funny too because what you hear in Latin American circles, including academia, is always that ISI, import substitution, industrialization, was a failure. It bred cronyism and nepotism or whatever, and kept alive industries that would have faltered otherwise. Yeah, that can be true. But every country that has ever become that ever industrialized used ISI policies, and they do this convenient thing where they say that, oh, no, the Asian tigers, they didn't do ISI, they promoted export-led growth. That's the same thing. The key difference is that I'm not completely opposed to free trade. There's smart ways of doing free trade, and there's smart ways of doing protectionism. The infant industries argument, you protect your native industry until you know that it can compete on a global level with competitors on the global stage. And that's exactly what every rich country eventually did. The corn laws in the UK. The UK embraced free trade when it was already, the top dog in the economic global system. Later, the same thing with the United States. But what you definitely don't do, which is what a lot of Latin American countries did, this is, for example, what it did an incredible amount of damage to Brazil's automotive sector, which I would have liked to talk about in the piece, but that would have, you would write a whole article on just this topic. Brazil had a significant automotive sector during the 20th century that it promoted. And when it liberalized, it opened it up to competition with imports during the 1990s. Domestic industry was just eviscerated. The reason why Embraer was successful was because just by chance, it managed to, and actually it's managed to survive by chance many times. But prior to being privatized, it was privatized in 1995. And it actually had to be put up for auction like 6 times because no one wanted to buy it. It was seen as just kind of a relic of the military dictatorship that was kept alive by cronyism and whatever. But importantly, before it was privatized, it made a key investment into regional jets that later really took off in the end of the 90s, just so that it just so happened while after it was privatized, that industry boomed. And because it had made that earlier investment, it turned into the company that it is today. And so in this case, it wasn't done strategically, it was more by chance. But yeah, what you want to do is remove barriers when you know that the company in question can compete globally. And that just happened to happen for Embraer. Funnily enough, later, I mentioned this in the piece, Bolsonaro, who historically was very skeptical of market fundamentalism, and because he was a military man, and he viewed the successes of the military dictatorship with a lot of pride. Once he became president, he completely embraced, market fundamentalism. That had a lot to do with his Chicago school economy minister. And in like his first week as president, he authorized the sale of Embraer to Boeing. And as we would have known it, a lot of Embraer's key divisions would have ceased to be Brazilian operations outright. It was even in talks at one point to drop the name Embraer. It would have become Boeing Brazil, at least in its commercial division. It just so happened that, Boeing has had a lot of problems in recent years, and then we had the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, Boeing could not go through with the merger, with the acquisition, because its finances were completely ruined by the pandemic. So again, by chance, Embraer lives on as a Brazilian company.
Yeah, and this is such an important thing of that gets clouded out too, is like the indigenousness of the company, because much can be said to, well, you can stimulate economic growth through multinational corporations doing foreign direct investment. And, why wouldn't you do that? They have the know-how, they have the technology, they have the capital, they can plug you into their system. And then, over time, you'll be more skilled, you'll have more infrastructure, plant equipment in your country. At the end of the day, it's always controlled by these companies. And as you've said in various other examples, the intricacies of like, what are you doing for that multinational? Like, are you doing assembly? Are you doing something else? Are they keeping certain pockets of the company and departments in their own native country versus yours? Are there vulnerabilities when headwinds come, like happened with Boeing, in terms of like reducing headcount and reducing infrastructure and investment? So yeah, if you could provide more of the abstract lesson and insight there of why is indigenous firm formation important versus just relying on multinational corporation FDI.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's having national champions will inherently benefit you. This is just kind of it's true when you have there are cases where you have multinationals and the wealth extracted or gained from having that multinational and extra Y emerging market benefits those at the bottom. But it's also not always the case. We see this, I can tell you this, for example, mining. There are a lot of cases where these communities, rural communities, have these mines run by Canadian or American companies, and they see little to no benefit from the gains. And that can certainly also be the case with some domestic companies. But manufacturing is good in that it tends to almost always in some way benefit the country where it's a host, at least to some degree. Even Mexico, that it has been stagnant for many years and didn't see the level of growth that was promised from the expansion of its maquilas. A lot of analysts do attribute the fact that there are these kind of, not entirely great, but steady jobs that pay better than a lot of others in northern Mexico, for the fact that we see actually today small minimal emigration out of Mexico into the U.S. Obviously, yeah, the people coming across the southern border are mainly Central American or South Americans, and even people from other continents. Mexican immigration is a phenomenon mostly of the 1990s and 2000s. It's not really present anymore. But there was something else I wanted to say. Shoot. You can go ahead, Peter.
No, but yeah, that's very, very informative. And then as we think about this too, I think what gets lost is like, okay, well, it's one firm. We tend to think about it in that sort of very discrete manner. But when thinking in terms of industrial clusters, the prospect of having a business firm is way more conducive to an industrial cluster that's building a more diversified supply chain, adjacent sectors, the adjacent sectors to those adjacent sectors, and you have like this is where you get like some exponential activity going on. Versus a multinational corporation, like they're going to be very adverse to obvious like local industrial cluster formation because they have industrial clusters in their native territory or in another, low tax jurisdiction or low wage jurisdiction.
Special economic zone. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you could speak to like, why are industrial clusters important?
Yeah, I mean it's key to cultivate industry in a coordinated way such that you can benefit from R&D and greater employment and the like. And I remember what I was going to say before, foreign direct investment is absolutely vital. It's totally necessary. The key is assimilating, absorbing the know-how and expertise of these multinationals that you might invite into your country, which is exactly what the Asian tigers did. What doesn't make sense is as in the Mexican case, is that you have these factories of you have like GM and whatever, but there's really no know-how expertise gained on a strategic macroeconomic level from that activity. You're just a worker assembling products to be sold to the United States.
Yeah. So now we've walked our way through a lot of the history. Now it's 2023. Obviously, around the world, everyone's been impacted by COVID and then like sort of the Ukraine war, supply chain crunch. And so there's problems there, but trying to maybe not make it totally about that because that's, kind of an anomaly. Where does Latin America stand and what are the potential futures for it?
Oh boy. I think this is a part of the podcast where we might get a little grim. I'll try to be hopeful though. I am actually I like to follow Lincoln's quote. I'm an optimist because the alternative doesn't do anything for me. But I do have a huge fear in that you look at demographics, and despite Latin America being a developing region, the fertility rate in most of the countries in the region has really gone down. In a lot of cases, it's just that or even below level of replacement. So what we're going to see in the coming decades is that the working age population will decline, and the region will start to have similar problems to developed countries, and there will be a greater need to support the elderly. And that's a key problem. We talk about development, and there's this kind of window, this demographic window of exactly the amount of years you need to take advantage of your working age population being in the workforce, precisely to promote development. And this is a problem that China will definitely have. Although all the doom and gloom is a little silly. I saw something, a really astute analysis that apparently they're loosening their hold on the hukuo system, which prevents internal migration. China is still one of the least urbanized countries in the world. You liberalize the hukuo, and that automatically gives you millions more workers. But you can't do that in Latin America, obviously. So the clock is ticking. Time is running out in a way. I guess the optimistic view is if some sort of developmental consensus can be forged in the coming decades, maybe that will come to encourage a lot of people to have more children, which will make the future a lot more viable as well. But on that note, I actually have been very impressed with Lula's current government. I was skeptical. I mean, I'll be honest. I thought he was when he won, I thought he was better than it was better to have him in there than Bolsonaro. But I was skeptical in that I thought that he would probably have absorbed a lot of the progressive groupthink, just kind of the fetish for renewables and green tech and hostility towards like the energy sector. And it turns out, no, he's is as pragmatic as he was in his previous term, which I don't even really think I say this in the piece. To me, Lula's first two terms really are not as successful as a lot of people credit him for. His real accomplishments were being a good steward over a booming commodities and agricultural sector, and also clamping down on deforestation, which he is currently doing, which is very good. On that environmental front, I completely support that. And so it's something like in his first 6 months, deforestation has gone down like 30%. That's excellent. Would I disagree with progressive, climate hawkery is where, we need to shut down oil. We need to shut down. It's like, no, dude, people need energy. People need cheap, abundant energy that's necessary for development. And Lula has actually authorized, to the chagrin of environmentalists, a ton of projects that will bring a lot of development to poor regions in Brazil, specifically in the Amazon. For example, he authorized the building of a highway through the Amazon, as well as oil exploration near the mouth of the Amazon, which is kind of controversial, as well as another two projects I forget. But yeah, this has infuriated environmentalists, but it's something that's popular. And he's reaped the rewards. Actually, incredibly, since he got into office, it was really a close election. His approval rating has gone up, even among voters of Bolsonaro. Similarly, I chalked it up previously just to talk. He had campaigned on reindustrialization, and I think on the night of his election victory, or during his inauguration, he said at one point, "We do not want Brazil to be condemned to the fate of permanently exporting primary products." And I just thought those, he was just kind of saying that, but wouldn't do much about it. But and to the chagrin of Washington, he's pursued a lot of strategic deals with China to bring investment in the form of factories. Specifically, BYD opened up a factory recently. There was an agreement struck to cooperate on semiconductor production. Similarly, he cut taxes for what are called popular vehicles. Those are like low-cost vehicles in Brazil to boost the automotive sector. And he's managed to do all this actually while managing to win over the hearts and minds of a previously very skeptical financial sector. His economy minister has turned out to be very liked now by Brazil's top and international financiers. So,
yeah, and one of the typifying examples of Lula's heterodoxy is that he has not gone along with the U.S. line on the Ukraine war.
Yeah, that's another thing where he's been great on. Yeah, a lot of people accuse him of being anti-American. That's absolutely untrue. Lula's not anti-American. He just, like any good leader, wants to pursue Brazil's national interests, not the interests of Washington. So, yeah.
Which is interesting because in a certain formulation, especially against Bolsonaro, one could assume that Lula is the favorite of the DC consensus, but like,
yeah, and that's funny because Bolsonaro was very close to the U.S. and he was less vocal about things, but on the Ukraine war, he was also neutral. He even visited Russia not long after the invasion. And members of Bolsonaro's party have actually, I think I saw this recently, come out against I think a governor whose name I forget that spoke in favor of Ukraine. There's actually a kind of horseshoe consensus that's interesting. It's more the stick in the mud centrists that have the prototypical view. But yeah, I should also say conversely, I'm Colombian. The president of Colombia, Petro, has been a disaster, which is sad because at least rhetorically, he also campaigned on a message of industrialization and all of that. It's typically the leftists that at least talk about industrialization. They tend to lose sight when they come into office focusing exclusively on redistribution. He's been terrible because he is just he completely embodies the progressive groupthink on energy. It's just, we're going to die in 12 years. We need to completely shut down oil exploration. And notably, this was super interesting. I wanted to write about this. There was recently an Amazon summit earlier this month in the city of Belém in Brazil. It's a city located on the Amazon River. Supposedly there was a bit of a clash between Lula and Petro, and that Petro didn't like Lula's policies of like authorizing oil drilling near the Amazon and other infrastructure projects and the whatnot. And analytically, to me, what's interesting is that this makes sense in that, you compare the Colombian Amazon to the Brazilian Amazon. Barely anyone lives in the Colombian Amazon. Obviously, it's a smaller country, but in the Brazilian Amazon, you have some dense urban centers. Yeah, like Belém and Manaus. People there have needs. There are roads that connect these cities. There are no roads that go through the Colombian Amazon. Yeah, it makes sense. You don't really need it. There aren't very many people that live there. So Lula really is just catering to the needs of his people, which is good. And you could still accuse Petro of being too ideological, and that I'm sure that the few people that do live in the Colombian Amazon, I've been there, would say that they'd like to see development of that sort. But it's just he's stupid.
Yeah, and then to maybe put a finer note on where Lee was coming from with economics. I have here in front of me, I'll just send you it in the chat, the link. But here's a tweet from Mariana Mazzucato.
Oh, yeah. Funnily enough, she is great. She actually proposed to Petro to be an economic advisor to him. And unfortunately, that went nowhere. He supposedly likes Mazzucato. Like I said, I would chalk a lot of this up to the problem of priorities among Latin American leftists, that they just get caught up in other things, other priorities over industrialization, even if they're sympathetic towards that. And unfortunately, on the right, there's an outright hostility just because of the prominence of market fundamentalism. This is loading. One sec.
Yeah. So essentially, you have Mazzucato hanging out with Lula, handing him one of her books, and he looks pretty content with it. And obviously, she represents this force of the resurrection of industrial policy, of the entrepreneurial state.
She's really good.
And I think our fellow travelers, let's say in the U.S., that might be you would say labeled as right-leaning with American Compass. I believe they have written very favorably of Mazzucato.
Sorry, I just loaded. Yeah, this is really good. That's good. Yeah. I mean, increasingly in the U.S. and in other developed countries on the right, there's more of a thinking towards, it's like, hey, even if we're the parties of business, doesn't that mean we like industry? So and increasingly, too, you have all these working class voters coming into a right-wing party, you think there'd be an interest in providing jobs for those workers. So sadly, in Latin America, we don't really see that.
Yeah. Well, this is where we see like something that's kind of often gotten forgotten. And I think in a way, like this is in service to sustaining the dichotomy of Marxism versus capitalism as a very insufficient framework to operate in, because what that just tells you is like it makes all business business, and it makes like all government government. And especially if the Marxists have anything to add, it's essentially redistribution, which you commented on before, is sort of like where sometimes these leftists, they just end up going towards redistribution. They don't think much about anything else. Whereas a more historical grounded economic framework, which the American founders like Hamilton, some of these others in other countries, all ascribed to, was they understood business is different, and business is contextual, it's geopolitical, it matters what activity you're doing. Is it unproductive? Is it productive? Who's gaining? Is it more of the elites gaining? Is it more of the common man? So like we've totally lost this complexity when we think about this. So instead, we're forced into, as you say, like, where's the business party? And it's like, well, we have the financialization party, but they have taken the mask of, well, we're all the economy is. There's nothing else.
Yeah. Here's a good critique of both sides. You know, if you only do redistribution is useless if you don't provide like stable, good long-term jobs for your country's population. And so like the perfect example of this, is Venezuela. It's like, they saw a boom during the 2000s because of high oil prices, and then after the crash, the country collapsed, and there was decreased inequality and whatnot because of all the redistribution Chavez did. And if anything, he deepened dependence on oil. I don't know if you've seen on Wikipedia, sometimes in the economy sections of different countries, they have these neat charts that show you the diversification of the economy in like blocks. Venezuela is absolutely incredible. It's like 99% oil. It's like crude, petrochemicals, like all of it. It's absolutely startling. And so, naturally, when after the crash of 2014, the country collapsed. A lot of that was mismanagement and horrific socialism or whatnot. I mean, it's just the really demonstrative example of how redistribution will only do so much for you. If anything, it can even be adverse. Conversely, right wingers just say it's just like, oh, no. The government can't pick winners and losers. So, any sort of state intervention, protectionism, that's all communism. And look at it. It's incredible. The economies of they're more extractive than say the U.S. But you look at, for example, the richest people in Latin American countries. It resembles a lot the richest people in, say, the United States or the UK. Who are they? They're bankers, telecom executives, what have you. It's these are all people that just have acquired their rent through the use of what Michael Lind calls toll booths. So, I mean, I have a lot of critiques of Elon Musk. And you just sent me this on X, as it's called now. But what we can say that's very good about Elon Musk is that he produces things of value, unlike Jeff Bezos, who a lot of people love Amazon, but at the end of the day, his wealth comes from controlling a toll booth, a logistical infrastructure that delivers packages. That's not actually very innovative or fantastic compared to, Tesla cars.
Yeah. Well, on another podcast, we can go in on critiquing Elon, which you appreciate there. But as we're kind of wrapping up, I think we should just and if you feel that you want to brush by it, that's cool because it's a new story. But the kind of news item du jour currently is the Argentinian upstart politician Javier Milei, who is the narco-capitalist who is gaining popularity and might try real libertarianism in Argentina. It's never been tried before. Yeah.
Tried. Yeah.
So I just want to see, like, what is your take on Milei, and how does that fit into this sort of wider discussion we've been having?
So I wrote an article about the Argentina primaries, the election last week. It was my inaugural column for Compact magazine, and to put it succinctly, my view is actually that one, you could only ever have a candidate like this be successful under the circumstances of like 100% inflation verging on hyperinflation. That's the only time real libertarianism has popular appeal. Although he's swung hard to the right on cultural issues, which also explains a large part of it, his success. But two, Argentina is such a special, horrible case that I might actually be inclined to support like short-term shock therapy that Milei espouses, in as much as just so as concerns controlling inflation. I mean, this is just a level of inflation that is unspeakable. You get paid and you immediately have to spend all your money because it'll be worthless in a few days. That having 100% inflation is just not good. The problem with Milei, however, is that if he's successful in taming inflation, which is big if, and Argentina's a very bizarre economy, but even if he's successful, and there's precedent for this, for example, like Fujimori in Peru, long term, he keeps going with his policies. It'll be disastrous. He's a real libertarian. Yeah. So any sort of effort towards development and industrialization, all of that is communism. So it's really a dead end there, but it's for Argentines to decide. Argentina is really it's a demonstrative case in one way, though still kind of inexplicable in others. 100 years ago, it was one of the richest countries in the world per capita. And the turmoil that the central issue is one of, it's specifically a political and economic stability. They've just oscillated all over the place between coups and populists and neoliberals, etc. But at the core of it really is that you always had these two camps: the rentier agricultural camp interested in exporting beef and whatnot to the global market. There was always opposed towards development and had a lot of political control, and more reformist populists, but also inept and megalomaniacal sectors under the banner of Peronism, Perón himself, and the Kirchners, most recently, that Cristina Kirchner is currently the vice president, and she is accused of like embezzling like something like $1 billion, and possibly had someone killed. It's a circus, really. But actually, to illustrate my point though on Milei, you look at Perón, for example, and in the early 50s, he actually had to engage in a degree of like orthodox economics because the economy began to overheat and started to experience higher inflation, nothing like today. But he actually took orthodox measures to get inflation under control. But after that, he continued his program of industrialization. That's what any smart, pragmatic leader would do. You adjust policies based on the needs of your people and the conflicts and problems that arise macroeconomically. But if you're just strictly an ideologue that just says, oh, look, I'm going to get inflation under control by slashing spending, privatizing, and destroying the central bank. Okay, hey, it worked, maybe. Now we're going to keep doing this and destroy the country. So,
yeah, and that's that's the thing. Like you say, it's about adjusting to the circumstance. I noticed that in the 1920s for Ireland, they had a very conservative fiscal and monetary policy, perhaps overly, but there's a degree of understanding that you can have for them if let's say, like, you're on the other side of that debate, where much of Europe getting out of World War I is experiencing episodes of hyperinflation, Weimar Germany being the most obvious, but there were episodes in Poland and a few other countries. And so, like, the new Irish government is seeing this, and like there's hyperinflation, and like new governments have been formed in other parts of Europe, and how they've kind of been crumbled. So you can almost like understand the degree that, okay, like, to just ride out the storm, because the Irish too, they came out of a war and then they come out of a civil war, and so they're dealing with all sorts of problems, like, to a certain degree, like austerity or fiscal monetary conservatism perhaps has a role just to like get your feet stable. But often, like we went on to say too, it's like that temporary adjustment becomes orthodoxy, and that becomes something you can't change over time when conditions change.
Exactly.
Yeah. So one little thing maybe I would love to quibble about is that certainly the Kirchners as a force, and Fernandez being a stand-in for them, he's number twos, Christina. Obviously, these people aren't squeaky clean, and like, and what you mentioned also in the Brazil article is like there's institutional problems that no amount of economic theorizing is going to sort out. That, like, that's the hard work of professionalizing your state bureaucracies, like, is what it is. So aside from just like giving some handicaps to say, okay, yes, there's corruption in various contexts and stuff like that, I see a lot of overzealousness, like critiquing the Kirchners as a, sort of the most flammable force in creating the condition Argentina is in currently. But when you kind of look at them, you see that they're a revival of some sort of Peronist aspiration.
Yeah, they did have a developmentalist bent, which was good.
Yeah. But what I would just like to point out is, like, when you look at the poverty rates and the GDP per capita, like from 2003 to 2015, I mean, like, you have incredible breakneck growth in reducing poverty and increasing the GDP per capita. And while there's certainly a nuanced debate to be had within that, it just seems it seems overzealous to suggest that the ideology that they back, that people suggest precipitated the inflation today, is a total like repudiation of what they did, when it's, what they did was, increase prosperity kind of indisputably in certain ways. So, like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's just like what is it that some conservatives say about Donald Trump, that he's an imperfect vessel. Similarly with the Kirchners, what's funny is that Nestor's finance minister actually also took orthodox measures in the beginning of Nestor's administration in 2003 to get to stabilize the economy. But it's just as with Perón, they pursued a developmentalist policy. And they're certainly to blame in that they weren't entirely responsible, or Cristina wasn't entirely responsible with monetary policy towards the end, and similarly now under Alberto, although there's a lot of other things going on, but the mainstream right in Argentina has a big part to do with its current problems also. Macri took over in 2015, beating Cristina's candidate Daniel Scioli in 2015, and he proceeded, in classic Latin American conservative fashion. It's like, what we need to jumpstart prosperity? We need some unfunded tax cuts. All right, you know what that did? That ballooned the debt. If you look at a chart, it's incredible. Something like 70-80% of Argentina's current debt came during Macri's administration, and it had largely to do with those tax cuts. It got to a point that he had to request a loan from the IMF. And that's made things even more complicated because now they consistently need to make these payments. And they even defaulted in 2020 during the pandemic because they couldn't make a payment. Incredibly, since 2020, total public debt has gone down something like 30%. And yet they need to keep making these payments that they can't always make. And inflation still keeps going up. Similarly, the current finance minister in Argentina has largely taken orthodox measures prescribed by the IMF to get inflation under control. Inflation still keeps going up. This is why I say that Argentina is a really unique, bizarre case.
Yeah, and so that's where a lot of these binaries and conventions kind of go out the window when certainly there's particularities and contingencies that must be observed, accounted for. And yeah, the deep historical legacies, the cattle ranchers, the industrialists, these things are much older and much more indigenous than people give them credit for, than some, which is ironic because perhaps like Malay is sort of like a weird international byproduct of like the Ron Paul movement. There was LibertyCon in DC, and then like 10 years later, Malay pops out in Argentina quoting like Americans.
Yeah. Oh, another thing. I talked to Jeff Schollenberger of Compact about this. I actually also view dollarization favorably. The problem is that carrying it out would be very difficult. Argentina is a big country, would need a lot of dollars, and its current reserves are very low. But if they were to, just aspirationally, to me, it sounds like a good idea because that would definitely get inflation under control. If Argentines are no longer responsible for their own money, inflation will no longer be a problem. Now things will definitely get more expensive, and I can tell you this from experience. Some years ago, I traveled to Ecuador by land in Colombia, and it's very noticeable. The second you cross over the border into Ecuador that uses dollars, things are a good 20-30% more expensive. Ecuador, El Salvador, Panama effectively, and even Venezuela in practice are dollarized, and that has significantly helped with inflationary pressures.
Yeah. And that's where, like, I was debating this with a few libertarians the other day on Twitter, and that's where it was like I was sort of pecking at this idea, like,
I think I saw that you wrote about how he's also anti-China, which is hilarious.
Perhaps, yeah, I was sort of more so picking at like under libertarian framework, like it's this weird idea of you're getting rid of your own national.
Oh, yeah. He wants to get rid of his own central bank, but then you're just at the mercy of the central bank of the Federal Reserve, which a lot of libertarians here hate for similar reasons.
Yeah, so. And I get in like center in terms of the severity of central banking, with the Fed as the worst example of it all. So this is where under libertarian framework, it's like odd to toss out your own currency, but then like dollarize and get back by the Fed.
A lot of this is because, like I was saying, the cult of the U.S.
Yeah.
For on the right in Latin America, there's just such an adoration for, the U.S. and its institutions. For a lot of, I'm sure you have for Milei and a lot of Argentine libertarians, in their mind, the Federal Reserve the U.S. Federal Reserve is this great, classical liberal institution.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where it's like, again, like as not a libertarian, as someone more protectionist and more like realist, I don't view like the Federal Reserve or like dollarization, like you're sort of saying, like it's not inherently bad, especially in the short term. Like you can see why that would get rid of some short term problems. Um, so like it's you have to adjust based on circumstances, and especially as I would say, it's like very contextual. Where like going back to Ireland again to show the other side of this is like where Latin America, in certain instances, could use dollarization to stabilize. Like Ireland is an example of like the other side of that, where they pegged themselves to pound sterling of the UK even after independence for so long that it actually hindered their development over the next 100 years. And so the effects of not actually generating their own sovereign central bank, their own sovereign currency that they would, they could regulate and direct their private banking sector. They could use the central bank to finance government fiscal stimulus. They could, devalue the currency when appropriate to compete.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just as Greece being, there's advantages and disadvantages to being able to control your own currency. I mean, one of the oldest strategies in the book is devaluing your currency to promote exports, which is something you can't do if you're forced to use the euro, like a lot of European countries are. So yeah, that's absolutely a disadvantage. And actually, you mentioned pegging to the British pound. Argentina actually pegged the peso to the US dollar in the 90s. It's called the convertibility era, and actually succeeded in taming the wild inflation of the 1980s. But interestingly, and I can't say this for certain, I need to read up more on it, but I've read some kind of allusions that actually might have contributed to the collapse in 2001, because it was sort of a kind of band-aid that masked underlying problems in the Argentine economy that then exploded in 2001, likely influenced by the Asian American the Asian financial crisis of 1998, which caused the run on the peso that collapsed the economy in 2001.
Yeah, and then what happens after the Asian financial crisis for Argentina, they default on their foreign debts and they devalue their currency, and we get the next decade plus of hockey stick GDP per capita growth and inverse hockey stick in terms of poverty reduction. So and they it's funny that all of these allegations of what happens when you devalue and default seemingly didn't really actually have the severe consequences after Argentina did that.
A lot of countries have done that. Ecuador famously under Correa did something interesting where he said that he came in and was like, we don't recognize a lot of this debt because we consider it to have been acquired illegitimately, and it was like, well, actually, you look into the details, and they kind of have a point there. but macroeconomically, it wasn't intelligent because they managed to write off a lot of their sovereign debt.
And it's funny. Again, I'll keep interrelating things back to Ireland. In an approximate example to that, in the 1920s, the Irish were in the first fledgling moments of dealing with the partition of Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. And basically the Southern state concedes finally the North on their negotiating, because Britain to this day, it's the largest debt forgiveness as a percentage of GDP of the country ever to occur. So instead of the Irish saying, hey, that debt we owe you is probably generated under illegitimate grounds based on the philosophy that created our revolution and thus this new state, So like we don't acknowledge that we have to pay you that debt. Instead, the Irish take the other way and they say, oh, we're going to get out of paying this debt by giving up this territorial question. At least for us as the institutional state, the paramilitaries will later go on in the 70s to restart that fight. But yeah, it's this interesting dynamic of like how you deal with debt, how people think these consequences matter. Like you said, they dealt with it by saying it's illegitimate, and there's a path of renegotiating that way. So it's these things are very dynamic, and this is why you need that global, I think, knowledge base to draw from. Because if you're just siloed in your own country or a very like small span of history, you don't have these lessons that other people went through. And so that's why I think this conversation is immensely valuable to have you reveal all this knowledge.
Yeah, and we've talked about this. Ireland is a really interesting case, and yeah, definitely has a lot of parallels with Latin America. I mean, it's funny because it's in Europe, but it's kind of like a peripheral country in Europe, and there is that colonial aspect with Britain. It's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and you can look at it as what is Europe outside of like it's France, Germany, and Britain.
Yeah,
and maybe we'll give some other countries their due, but that is where the geopolitical strategy really centers around, the economic structures really center around. And so the Eastern Europeans, like Poland, for example, they kind of represent a similar periphery. Certainly the pigs of Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain to some degree, during the housing crisis. And how there was an inspiration after the financial crisis of 2008 for a breakup of the Eurozone, of a lot of debates happening in regards to the European Central Bank and its subsequent Eurozone. Really is just a deliberate attempt by like Germany and France to screw over the peripheral states of Europe and have their industrial sectors benefit at the expense of those industrial sectors. So, those conversations, basically got solved by just more debt being thrown at the periphery.
Greece's economy still hasn't recovered to pre-08 levels. So I mean, this is just like, dude, there could not be a more cut and dry case. The country would have been better off if it never adopted the euro, possibly from the European Union.
Yeah, and so this is so we'll see with Europe, what might happen with the Eurozone. I mean, it does seem like all of the fire went out of breaking it up, but with what happened with COVID and the Ukraine war and making the economics like very weird, I think we're probably going to see a rebound of talks like that. It'll be interesting to watch of like, is there going to be a common currency in Latin America too? Like what's going on with that? And the lei certainly then brings in like a whole new wild card to those conversations.
Yeah.
So go on.
No, I said absolutely.
Yeah. So to end off, so thanks, and please plug any links or things you're working on for the listeners. And as a trivia question, like provide any like what are some really good books you think people should check out that is tangential to what we've been discussing today?
I think we talked a great deal about this actually. I would in Latin America, I would urge readers to go back and read the framers, Bolivar, San Martin, etc. And more recently, it's funny if you read texts from current Latin American thinkers. Spanish writing on like political theory is famously arcane and difficult even to translate it into English. But regarding populism, which is a really important and systemic phenomenon in Latin America with good reason. It's like the most unequal region on earth. An Argentine thinker called Laclau, who actually advised the Kirchners, I actually have a lot of disagreements with, but it's interesting and worth taking a look at. I would urge, for everyone to read their report on manufacturers of Hamilton's, Friedrich List, and the Careys, who I still need to read it more on. In the contemporary era, read American Compass, read American Affairs. As books go, read Michael Lynn's Next American Nation and Land of Promise. Two excellent books on political economy and other topics in the U.S.
Awesome. And thank you for the Carey plug. And I will say, because the Careys are very hard to get into, because it's just very turgid and dense and just luminous. After being, sort of a librarian of their writings, I do say, I think if you're going to start with one of the Careys books, go for the Unity of Law. I do think that is it presents the sort of most zoomed out bird's eye view of what they're talking about. And it has a lot of kind of philosophy baked into it that in a weird way, it grounds it, makes it more relatable. Even though maybe it shouldn't, but that's a really good way to enter their worldview and what they're talking about. So the Unity of Law, if you can find that. Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I'll include some links below so you can go check out his work. And thanks for listening.
Oh, and yes, check out Compact, where you'll see my columns. So I'll be on there regularly now.
Great. Well, thanks for all your wisdom today.